Hey folks, it's Dustin back with another video here for the Disc Golf channel. And one of the biggest things I'm noticing with the first few videos I've released on this channel is that people have a lot of questions about disc and how they fly and what certain terms mean. And while by no means am I an expert in disc golf, I feel like I know a little bit about the sport. And I realize that the vast majority of my audience right now on this channel are people coming over from the esports industry that know my work as a commentator, either because they're a fan or they're a colleague of mine or whatever the case may be. And so they have basically zero knowledge of disc golf. So this video is probably not going to be for any section of my audience that is more experienced or that does know a lot about disc golf. A lot of things I'm going to say in this video are things that you certainly already know, or maybe you know even more about it than I do. And again, I by no means am a top level player or, an expert. And so I will be linking some videos down below to serve as some resources if you really want to learn more about disc golf and learn more about terminology and flight characteristics of disc and how everything impacts how a disc flies and really all that good stuff. But I at least wanted to put this video out there for my esports folks out there who are watching this channel to at least give them some basics. So that way, whenever they watch me play a round of disc golf, they know what I'm talking about, or they understand why a disc is flying a certain way. And there's a lot of different factors that come into play when you're thinking about how a disc flies. For one, it's about how you throw it. If you're throwing with proper form and technique, your disc is going to fly more true to how the disc is supposed to fly than if you're throwing it incorrectly. So that's one thing. The other thing that will affect a disc and how it flies is going to be its mold. So, for example, you have putters that are going to be a lower speed. You can see the speed there is 2. And so that generally means that these types of discs aren't going to fly as far or have as much potential for distance as discs that are of a higher speed. So, for example, a distance driver, as you can see here, it has a much wider rim. It's definitely a lot sharper as opposed to this one. That's certainly a lot more rounded on the edge. And so this has potential to fly further if thrown properly. And you can see that that's also denoted on its speed, as this is a disc that, if the autofocus will cooperate, is going to be 12 as opposed to the 2 that was on the putter. So the mold will certainly determine its flight characteristics as far as distance and such goes. Though it's not entirely always true. Top level players could probably throw a putter further than you can throw a fairway driver, for instance, even if you're throwing with good technique. So there is a little bit of give and take there, right? Then it's about the angle that you release the disc on will also determine how it flies. For when you release a disc, you can release it flat and then it'll fly a certain way. Then you can release it at an angle and it'll fly a different way depending on what angle you put it on. And I'll describe this a little bit more when we actually get out to the field and I start throwing discs, because I feel like it'd be really hard for me to explain all that just by looking at you right here, right now. Then, of course, things that will also determine how a disc flies is how hard you throw it. How high is your arm speed? The better the arm speed, the more distance you're going to get, for one. But for two, it's also going to affect how the disc flies. So, for example, if you want a disc to go really, really straight, you want to be able to have enough speed with your arm to actually get the disc up to speed so that it'll travel straight. If you throw it too slow, it's just going to want to bank towards the ground a lot sooner than if you had thrown it with proper speed. And that's why I've said in other videos that if you're trying to get into disc golf and you're very new to the sport and you don't have very high arm speed or you don't have very good technique, if you try to go throw a distance driver, those discs require higher arm speed to fly properly and actually get distance. So if you are new and you try to throw a distance driver and you have slower arm speed, you're not going to get much distance and you're going to have a really bad time. So that's why I always recommend trying to throw things like putters and mid-ranges and fairway drivers before you get to distance drivers. It's to get better, learn proper technique and form. There's plenty of instructional content out there on how to learn how to throw. I'll try to put some of that in the description below as well. And so that's that. Now, other things that'll affect how a disc flies is its weight. Typically the weight will kind of just impact how much the disc wants to roll over, how it wants to stay flat. The wind will obviously impact how the disc is going to fly. Then also the type of plastic on the disc will certainly, certain plastics are more durable or thicker, and just that will certainly impact how a disc flies, as well as the condition of the disc. If a disc is more beat up, and so it's going to be less durable, maybe it doesn't hold its form as much, then it's going to be impacted by how it flies as well. And this is when you get into the concept of stability. So if a disc is stable or neutral, that means that it flies pretty natural to its intended flight characteristics. So essentially, a right-handed throw, a backhand, is going to eventually go to the left at the end of its flight. It's going to go straight for some amount of time, depending on speed, wind, all that good stuff, and then it's going to want to dip to the left. That's just how a right-handed backhand works. For a left-handed backhand, it'll release, go straight, and eventually go to the right. Now, if you have an understable disc, as we'll see in some video in just a bit, an understable disc is going to want to go away from that natural flight path. It's understable. It's going to want to turn over. And so this can sometimes be denoted on a disc by the turn characteristic. So if here you can see on this disc I showed earlier with the speed of 12, you can see that -3 number, and that's the turn rating. So a negative number, the lower the negative number, the more that this is going to want to turn over away from that natural left finish that a backhand would do and actually roll more over towards the right. So that is one thing to notice. Now an overstable disc is going to be the exact opposite. That turn number is going to be closer to 0 or maybe even above 0. And that means that disc wants to really go left on a right-handed backhand or really go right on a left-handed backhand. And so that's whenever we start talking about things like stable versus overstable, all that good stuff, just understand that for me as a right-handed backhand player, if I throw a stable disc, it's going to fly pretty neutral, pretty flat, with a little bit of left finish. If I throw an understable disc, it's going to want to go to the right on a backhand. If I would throw an overstable disc, it's really going to want to go to the left on the backhand. It's the reverse for a left hand. Forehands are also the reverse. So a right-handed forehand tend to go to the right. If it's overstable, it's going to go even more to the right. If it's understable, it wants to go left a bit and then probably finish right at some point in time. So that's kind of what I mean by stable, understable, overstable, all that good stuff. It's also worth noting that this stability is not just black and white. So just because something is understable doesn't necessarily mean it's the most understable, right? There's varying degrees of understability, just like there's varying degrees of overstability. So some discs might be more overstable than others, but they still might be considered pretty neutral. Also, some discs for you that might feel really overstable and really dip to the left if you throw in a right-handed backhand, for more advanced players might fly more straight. So again, it all kind of depends. Also, another thing that I've noticed is when people use the term stable, sometimes they actually mean overstable, and that's where things get confusing. So that's why I try to use the word neutral more often than not. So you may hear the word neutral thrown around, you may hear the word stable thrown around, and they virtually kind of mean the same thing. So if someone says a disc is really stable, they likely mean it flies really straight, whereas really overstable or really beefy means, again, that strong hook to the left, and something more understable or flippy is, again, going to want to go the opposite direction of what you're naturally throwing on. But then we get into this concept of release angle. There's a difference between releasing a disc flat, releasing a disc on what we call hyzer or anhyzer. And now we're going to get out into the field so I can show you what I'm talking about. So now we're going to go ahead and get to some film of me throwing out in the field so I can better break down some of these terms and better illustrate how discs fly. So in this first clip, you're going to see me throw a disc that is neutral, so stable, so it's not overstable or understable, so it's not more prone to turning over or more prone to really dipping to the left on a right-handed backhand, but you'll see that it's still going to have a left finish. So with this being a neutral disc, I'm going to throw it flat, I'm going to throw it straight, and as you can see, it's going to go straight for quite some time, and then it's eventually going to dip out into the left, and that's essentially just how a backhand is naturally going to operate until you start throwing in other factors like disc stability and the angle of release. So on this part, I'm going to show you a hyzer release. So very quickly, a hyzer release on a backhand is when the outside of the disc is facing away from the body or basically just being pointed at the ground. That's the best way I can put it. This is what we call hyzer. And basically, when you put a disc on hyzer on a backhand, you are emphasizing that angle it already wants to naturally fly on. We already saw a disc likes to fly straight on a backhand and then eventually go a bit to the left. This just emphasizes that more, so it's going to make it go left sooner and just exaggerate that flight a little bit more. Now, this is a neutral disc, not an overstable disc or an understable disc, so it's not going to impact it that much. And this is also a putter, so it's a lower speed disc. But as you'll see in this flight, whenever I release it on hyzer here, it is going to want to go left much sooner than the previous throw. You can see it carries left basically the entire time. So that is how a hyzer release angle impacts the disc flight. So now I'm going to throw a neutral disc on anhyzer. And so this is when the outside of the disc is going to be pointing towards yourself or towards the sky. And again, I'm starting it on a different angle. I'm starting it on an angle that wants to take the disc to the right on a backhand. And so a neutral disc like this is going to want to go to the right just as I released it, and then eventually it flattens out and kind of just pushes straight. This is because this is neutral. And so therefore it takes the angle that I put it on, it flies that way, and then it just kind of straightens back out to be neutral as its natural flight characteristics indicate. Now this disc I'm throwing here is slightly understable. So remember, that means that it naturally kind of wants to go to the right, but it's a putter, so it's not going to go that hard to the right. And I'm going to release it on a bit of hyzer. This is what we call a hyzer flip. So essentially I'm going to start it at this angle where the bottom of this disc is pointed towards the ground and it wants to fly to the left, but because it's understable, remember, that wants to turn over, it's actually going to turn over off that angle and then start flying straight. So you can see I have this angle pointed towards the ground, and when I release it that way, since it's understable, it's going to flip this up to make the disc entirely flat and fly straight. As you can see, it just rides straight. It even goes a bit to the right because it is understable, so it still wants to go to the right, but by putting it on that hyzer angle, I was able to start it on an angle that intends to go to the left, which allowed it to flip up the flat, ride straight before it eventually went a little bit to the right. Now I'm going to start throwing some understable disc on a backhand. And remember, understable means it wants to turn over. It wants to go to the right. And so this first throw, I'm taking an understable driver and I'm going to throw it pretty flat, and you can see it just wants to go to the right. You can see it just kind of panning a bit to the right towards that tree and then eventually fades to the left. And that's because I kind of put maybe a touch of hyzer on that shot. I didn't throw it completely flat, so I didn't want to go super hard to the right. It kind of just wanted to go a bit right because that's the natural flight path of the disc, and then it kind of straightened out. Now this one I threw really flat, and as you can see, it just is panning to the right pretty much the entire time before it eventually settles and falls to the left. I also do that a bit nose up, and remember, throwing the disc nose up kind of makes it stall and kind of stop and just start kind of dipping left towards the ground. So that was me throwing poorly by throwing the disc nose up. So wanted to illustrate that concept of throwing the disc nose up. Now this is another understable disc. This time I got the nose down, I threw it flat, and as you can see, it just wants to go right. It wants to go really, really right and just dig into the ground because it's a very understable disc. So it's going opposite of what the natural flight path of a right-handed backhand is. That's why we call it understable. And now with this throw, I'm going to throw an understable disc again, but this time I'm going to lift that bottom part of the disc up towards myself and put it on that anhyzer angle, which is going to exaggerate the fact that this disc is really understable, wants to go to the right. I'm just going to make it even go harsher to the right. So as you can see, I started out way out here, but I put on that anhyzer so it's flying way to the right. And that just kind of emphasizes that again. Now, if you have a really understable disc and you really put it on anhyzer, you really put your whole body into it, and you really put it on that angle towards the right, as you can see here, you can throw what's called a backhand roller shot. And so this disc is really understable. I'm going to be pointing the bottom of the disc towards me. I'm even going to put my whole body into it. As you can see, I really threw my body into that. And because I did that, as you can see here, not only is this going to want to go to the right, but it literally just flips all the way over and just starts rolling forward. Unfortunately, you can't really see it, but eventually it just gets, straight up and down and just rolls forward and gets way down here before it eventually settles right there into the ground. Now we're going to take a look at overstable discs. Now remember, overstable discs are going to be even less prone to rolling over. They're going to want to get to the left. So I'm going to release this overstable disc really flat, and as you can see, it's going to go severely to the left, and it's just going to keep riding left the entire time because it's overstable, and so it wants to get left on that right-handed backhand. Now on this throw, I'm throwing the same disc, but I'm throwing it with hyzer, so the bottom of the disc facing down, if you remember, towards the ground, or away from me, away from my body, and because of that, you'll very clearly see that, as you can see, bottom facing down, it's going to go even harsher to the left. I threw it really high, so it doesn't look as exaggerated, but it really starts going left hard. I mean, you can just see it nosedive. That's what we can sometimes call a spike hyzer. So if you want a disc to get around an obstacle and kind of just go to the left to get around it and then just spike into the ground, you would throw an overstable disc on hyzer. So it just exaggerates that angle to fly to the left as hard as possible. Now, another cool thing that you can do with an overstable disc is you can throw it on anhyzer. And what this is going to do is, because you're putting it on that angle to go to the right, it's going to go to the right, but because it's overstable and it wants to get left, it's going to come out of that and eventually get over to the left. This is how you can take an overstable disc and get more distance out of it. It's called a flex line. So you're going to put it on the angle it doesn't want to fly on. It starts that way, but then it eventually rolls over, goes a bit straight, and then rolls over to the left, and that can get you left. But if you want to get more distance before it ends left, this is how you can do it. So this is me throwing an overstable putter, my harp, and I'm going to throw it on the anhyzer, so it goes right to start with, but then you can see it flattens out, it rides for a bit, and then it's going to dip to the left because it's overstable, and that's what it wants to do. And so here we go. I'm throwing another overstable disc on anhyzer. It's rolling right to start with towards that pole on the right-hand side, but then it starts panning back to the left. And so that's, again, the example of me taking an overstable disc and throwing on an anhyzer to just flex it, to get that extra bit of distance, but still getting that left finish that you would want. And this is just another example of me throwing another overstable disc on anhyzer, forcing it to the right, but because it's overstable, it eventually fights its way out of it, goes straight a bit, and then dips off to the left. All right, so at this point, we've kind of gone over what a right-handed backhand looks like. Remember, a neutral disc is going to want to fly straight and then eventually pan a bit to the left. An overstable disc thrown flat is going to go really hard to the left. An understable disc is going to want to go to the right, and then the angle you release it on exaggerates it. So now I'm going to show you some forehands, and so this is the opposite. The disc wants to go to the right after flying straight for some amount of time. That disc, you can see, flew straight for a bit, then pans out to the right. This disc, I'm going to put it on hyzer. Now, on a forehand, hyzer means the outside of this, again, it's facing towards the ground, facing away from me. So it already puts it on that angle towards the right. And so that's what I do with that disc, and you can just see how harshly it wants to get to the right. It goes way to the right in comparison to how I threw the first disc. Now, just like you can do flex lines with the backhand, you can do the same thing with a forehand. So remember, a forehand naturally wants to go to the right with a neutral or overstable disc. An overstable disc wants to get even more to the right. So this is an overstable disc, but I'm going to throw it anhyzer. So the bottom of the disc facing towards me, facing towards the sky, which puts it on an angle to want to go to the left. As you can see here, the disc is already kind of angled to want to go to the left. And so that is going to flex it. It's going to go left at first, but because it's overstable, because it's a forehand, it's eventually going to straighten out and then eventually even dip off to the right. So there you see it. It dips to the left. But again, as it's a forehand and it's a stable disc, it eventually flattens out and then tombstones into the ground towards the right-hand side. Here is another example of me throwing a forehand on a flex line. So taking a more overstable disc that wants to get right, but throwing it left intentionally, and then it eventually comes out of it and pans back off to the right. Now here's an example of me throwing an understable disc with a bit of hyzer or more flat. So the disc wants to go to the left because it's understable. Remember, when a disc is understable, it wants to go opposite to the natural flight path that the way you're throwing it would normally want to go. So this disc is a little bit more flippy. So on a forehand, it wants to get left, but then even though it exaggerates to the left, it eventually straightens out and then pushes straight. So now, to help with terminology a bit more, you'll hear some people call understable disc flippy, again, because it wants to turn over. It wants to flip over and ride opposite to what the throwing technique would naturally put a disc on. If a disc is really overstable, people might call it beefy or something along those lines, just indicating that it is very overstable. That's it for this video. I really just wanted to give you some basic ideas on what certain disc golf terms meant and how disc fly in disc golf. I know that I probably haven't done the best job of explaining things. I know that some of this might be a little bit complicated because it's a lot of information all at once, but I knew that a lot of people following this channel from the esports side of things may not watch any other disc golf content besides what I put out. Maybe they're not curious enough to dig deeper into the sport, and so I wanted them to at least have a little bit of something that I explained to them about how disc fly and what certain words mean. Again, I have put some links down below in the description if you want to learn more, or some other folks out there who are more knowledgeable than me have put out some really fantastic content that describes all this stuff in a lot more detail and likely a lot more accurately than I did. But anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please follow, subscribe, ring the bell, drop comments, feed that algorithm, and be on the lookout for more disc golf content coming very soon. Thanks again.